Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our monthly Flawless Execution webinar series. In this month's webinar, Flawless Execution is Agile for Business. We're going to talk about organizational agility and how flawless execution adds agility to your business. Now, this is also our largest webinar by far. We have team members from GE Aviation. We've got over 350 people alone from Boeing. We've got folks from tech companies like Oracle, Google, VMware, Hewlett-Packard, med device companies like Becton Dickinson, Medtronic, Boston Scientific, and then the blue chips, General Motors, John Deere, Citigroup, Procter & Gamble. Everybody's here from all different functional groups, all different industries for one thing, and that's to figure out how do we create organizational agility. As the world moves faster and faster, as we struggle to keep up with our markets, how do we stay ahead of that rate of change and allow ourselves to take advantage of the change that's taking place? Well, we've had the opportunity to have a voice in the Agile community lately. We're just coming off of a couple of keynotes that we were able to give at the closing session for the Scrum Alliance Global Gathering, and we have some PMI events that we've been doing recently as well. So we've been a part of this conversation for quite a bit now and been able to get some great observations about what's working and what we're still being challenged by as we attempt to take agility out of functional groups and put it across the entire organization. I am your webinar host. My name is Joel Thor Neeb. Feel free to link up with me on LinkedIn following this event. My name is Joel. My friends call me Thor. My parents called me Joel. Thor is a call sign. That's my nickname. That's what I got because for the first 17 years after graduating from the Air Force Academy, I spent those as a fighter pilot and trainer pilot in the United States Air Force. After that, I went on to get my MBA from the University of Texas, and today I'm the president of Afterburner. And at Afterburner, we leverage the techniques and the skills and the core competencies that we were forced to develop in the high-stakes, complex, dynamic environment of aerial combat. So when I was flying Mach 2 with a couple of 24-year-old wingmen that I'm trying to keep from running into each other or running into that mountain inside the cloud, in this incredibly complex environment with 350 switches and dials in front of me, I've got to be able to distill this into the few critical components that I can pay attention to at any point in time. We had to do that not only as individuals, but as a team. But you're struggling to do the same thing, right? I mean, we're all in a marketplace today where things are moving faster than ever. Globalization has taken the business cycle from 7 years down to 3 years, and that means that we used to be able to get a profit from a product for about 3 years before the competition could catch up. Now that's down to 3 years. The competition's able to steal market share very, very quickly. We better have that next product in the hopper and that next innovative plan in the hopper just waiting to be released. We know that if you've joined the S&P 500, you used to be able to stay there for around 34 years. That was the average tenure of the top 500 publicly traded companies. These days, that's down to about 14 years, and that's because they're being kicked out by other up-and-coming companies more quickly than they had in the past. The world, the market, everything's moving faster than ever before, and so it requires us to be agile to keep up with it. As the world changes around us, we need to be able to take advantage of the new resources, and we need to be able to mitigate the new threats. We're going to talk about the promise of agility, what it can do for your organization. We'll talk about the flawless execution advantage, how we apply our methodology to help create organizational agility. And then we'll talk about organizational agility in general. What could it mean to your teams? What does it mean to reach across the aisle, across the silo, and develop a shared vision? And finally, we'll start talking about some steps to get you there. In other words, the initial steps to take to start marching down this path. Well, we're here pretty much because of this quote that occurred in The Economist recently, and this captures a lot of the sentiment from CEOs and leaders that we talked to lately. And it talks about how the majority of executives cite organizational agility as being key to their global success, and there's a lot of research that backs that up. So empirical evidence from MIT shows that agile firms grow revenue 37% faster and generate 30% higher profits. But it's that last sentence that gets us, right? Yet most companies admit they are not flexible enough to compete successfully. And while most companies have brought in an agile mentality and potentially one vertical or within one functional group, it's very difficult to scale that across the entire organization. Before we talk about how to scale that across the entire organization, Let's talk about where this whole concept of Agile came from and being agile and having agility within the marketplace. Well, around the turn of the century, in 2001, some key software leaders got together and went skiing for a weekend up in Utah. And these software leaders were pretty frustrated because they were coming from an environment where things were moving faster than ever before. They had increasing complexity of software. Their object-oriented software was changing faster and faster around them, and they're trying to develop and stay ahead of that change, but it was very challenging. Next up, we had Moore's Law, so we had software changing quickly, but we also had hardware improving and becoming more complex. So they were basically making products for yesterday's marketplace. If you know Moore's Law, it says basically that the microprocessors and the chips were doubling in size and capabilities every 2 years, which means that if we take too long on our current products, we're building for yesterday's marketplace. And they said, you know what, we're letting the system dictate our actions. We see these problems. We're closest to the action as the developers. We need to put the power in the hands of the people on the front lines and allow them to make the decisions. They created this Agile Manifesto, and it has some critical priorities, and a few of them were the following. Individuals and interactions over processes and tools, meaning we're going to emphasize people over features. We're no longer going to create 1,000 fonts within our microprocessor that nobody uses. We're going to focus on people in this process and make sure that we're looking at the end user in the conversation. Working software over full documentation. Don't let good enough be the enemy of perfect. Let's get something out there and iterate quickly on it to continue improving it. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation means we're not beholden to a rigid plan. We are beholden to the customer's needs, because at the end of the day, that's who we're trying to make happy at all times. And then last, of course, responding to change over following a plan. Don't let a rigid, structured plan dictate your actions, or a rigid, structured contract dictate how you're creating that software. We want to be able to make it as the world changes, as our client needs change, and respond to change in the marketplace. Sounds like a great idea, right? Well, we, as fighter pilots, had been operating with an Agile mindset for many decades before that. And it stands to reason. One of the people that came up with the Agile Manifesto was a former fighter pilot himself, and a great individual. But this is an opportunity to look at the difference between an Agile mindset and a more hierarchical top-down mindset. It's a great experiment, great little laboratory that we're able to use here, because during the Cold War, around 1950, when we each went off in our own camps, the United States and the former Soviet Union, what you had taking place is they're both trying to accomplish the same thing, but they went about it very differently. And if you can imagine it, they didn't share their secrets, they didn't share their processes, so in isolation, they went in very different, diverging directions with the way that they approached winning this Cold War, winning the battles that they thought they would be fighting. Let's talk about what that difference looked like. For the former Soviet Union, their focus was on technology. They said, we're going to have the best missiles, we're going to have the best engines, we're going to make sure we got the best features, right? If you can pattern this after the software conversation, this is like the echo chamber that occurs when they're developing software, or you're developing a new product and you're not keeping the end user in mind, you're focusing just on features that you're creating for yourself. Versus the United States said, we're going to focus on the user. Technology is important. We want to create great planes. We want to create capable technology, but at the end of the day, we're going to bank on having the best human capital, and we're going to have to put our emphasis and our training and our efforts into that user to be effective. The culture was very different as well, extremely hierarchical in the former Soviet Union. Hierarchical to the extent that you could not turn your aircraft while you're in a dogfight unless the person who's watching this all take place from a radar screen many miles away tells you to. So there's one bottleneck, one person controlling this entire scenario. And you kind of see why that made sense initially, because they thought, hey, this is an $80 million aircraft. I don't want to take the chance that this new pilot is going to make a mistake with this. So for the first couple of missions, it might have made sense, and they kept that pilot safe. But very quickly, that pilot gained the knowledge and had the situational awareness, and sitting there looking outside at the battle space was able to assess what they should be doing, but couldn't make that decision. They weren't empowered to make that decision like the individuals were in the United States. When I turned 24 and I started flying F-15s, they basically threw the keys to the plane to me and said, don't crash it. You work with your team, use the processes in place, iterate, become better each time, and achieve your mission objectives. That's a very different message than a top-down hierarchical approach. You're empowering people at the closest level, closest to the action. And then finally, their data collection. As they took the information from the cockpit, as they took the information from the environment, they would send that back to headquarters and send that back to the leadership to, once again, centralize control of that decision-making and the execution, and that was the bottleneck for all of their decisions. Pair that against our team of teams. We had collaborative teams that were working on every single mission, and not just collaborative within the fighter pilot community, but we would bring in the weather officers and the maintenance team and the intelligence crew, because we wanted to all plan together to better understand each of our incentives and know that we all had one mission objective that we were aligned behind. And so this experiment came to an end, right? Because the Iron Curtain was raised, the Berlin Wall fell, and all of a sudden we got to take a peek across the aisle and see the differences between the way that we were approaching this same objective. One was very agile, one was very top-down and hierarchical. And we said, hey, we're all friends now. Let's go out flying. Let's, see what would have happened if we would have gone up against each other. And even though the former Soviet Union had arguably better missiles, better engines, in 99% of the cases, the United States dominated in those training scenarios. And it was because they emphasized that frontline user and agile approach that allowed them to adapt and react to the change that had taken place over the past 40 years in technology and tactics and everything else that they could take advantage of and stay ahead of that rate of change. The only way we were able to do that within the Air Force and as fighter pilots is by having an iterative cycle to approach it. And if you're an agilist and a purist at Agile, you understand iterative cycles very well. And you know that whether it's Deming's plan, do, check, act, or it's Lean's build, measure, learn, or even the OODA loop that was created by another fighter pilot, the whole point of an iterative cycle is that we're able to collaboratively get together and plan as a team, come up with that mission objective, get insights, but more importantly, get their inspired alignment, then go brief, serve as a call to action, bring all the great takeaways from the plan front of mind, go out and execute with agility, be able to adapt and react to the inevitable threats that take place. And then finally, and probably most importantly, debrief. Look backwards, identify the successes, the failures, what are we being challenged by, where are the pockets of success, and then turn that into a lesson learned for the next plan. That's an important concept because that's going to be at the heart of creating organizational agility. What can that mean for your teams? Here's some of the observations we have for teams that are able to create organizational agility. First of all, you create a culture of trust and safety. When you start doing debriefs, when you start collaborating, reaching across the aisle, all of a sudden you're creating a secure environment where everyone feels that they got one team, one sense of purpose, one mission that they're all supporting. And that's very important from the human perspective that we're creating that for our teams at all times. You create a mentality that's geared towards continuous improvement, and the only way we know we're improving is if we have clear mission objectives, clear lines in the sand by which we can determine whether or not we're succeeding or failing. We want to measure the outcomes of the organization or your department as a whole, and this is a critical one. The great example for this is U.S. Steel. When they were challenged in the past, they decided that we're going to stop incentivizing the company by each plant. So they had all these plants dotted across the U.S., and they said, instead of just focusing on plant success, let's just make it organizational success, and we'll break down those barriers. And what happened was, as soon as they stopped having the plants compete against one another, and they're all working together, they found that they shared best practices, they stomped out mistakes that were taking place, they weren't reinventing the wheel at every one of their locations, because they created this learning environment that measured the entire organization as a whole. Next, you help to avoid losing sight of those long-term gains for short-term profitability. I tell you, you could do an entire webinar on this concept alone. It's such a challenge right now. We have the shareholder mentality, which is to say that for a publicly traded company, the shareholder, the person who bought stock, is the owner, right? Well, it used to be that shareholders kept a stock for about 5 years. Now they keep it for around 7 months. So the demand and the incentive coming out of the quote-unquote owners is to fix next quarter's earnings. There's a great Harvard Business Review article out of the last version that talks about this, how this is completely changing the landscape for publicly traded companies in a bad way, because it's forcing us to have a myopic focus where we only look at the next quarter and we don't look at our long-term strategy. And then finally, you want to be able to exploit changes in the marketplace. Now, notice I didn't say adapt to change in the marketplace. This isn't just about being reactive. This isn't just about seeing what's happening around you. This is about not only seeing what's changing, but being the first to be able to react to it, the first to be able to exploit it. Your competitive advantage now becomes that you're able to move faster in the marketplace than everyone else. We have some great examples of organizational agility that's working, but we also have some examples of some cautionary tales when it hasn't worked, right? And Blockbuster is a perfect one. We all know that this story. Blockbuster had the opportunity for probably a decade to start moving in the direction that the market was, as it was moving towards Netflix and streaming video and all these great opportunities for them. They had the resources. They had the database. They had the brick and mortar store. They were the media giant. And everyone in the world, including the Blockbuster employees, saw this coming. But like lemmings, they continued running for the cliff. And I think it's because they were so short-term focused, so focused on their quarterly goals that they could never take a step back and say, how is this affecting our long-term strategy? The other one is Circuit City. Circuit City was one of the darlings of the Good to Great book by the great Jim Collins, where he talked about how this was a built-to-last organization. But as soon as Circuit City was challenged by an online purchasing environment where people were coming in and they call it showcasing their items inside the store, they'd go back and buy them online. They weren't able to respond to that. They didn't adapt to the marketplace. They didn't react and exploit that change in a positive way. And the last one's Nokia. Nokia basically had the keys to the kingdom. Nokia had the technology well before Apple did for the touch screen, for things like the iPad. All this technology was at their fingertips. They had the opportunity to use it. And here's the most important part. Their team members on the front lines were screaming for it. They said, this is what the customer wants. They'd love to use it. But like the former Soviet Union, they took all of that decision-making and kept it at a high level and kept the people closest to the action from making those decisions. And of course, we know that they were too late to the game and weren't able to make a sizable business impact because of it. All right, so you're saying, fine, Thor, I get it. We need to become more agile. As an organization, what are the steps that are going to get us there? Well, earlier I shared with you the iterative process we use, and I started with plan. I said plan, brief, execute, debrief. You might be surprised, but we typically start with the debrief. Let me give you an example. So last summer, we were asked to come into a tech company where they had just recently merged two very different cultures, but it was going to be great, right? They'd merged two different types of products. They're going to be able to sell to a wider audience, improve their market. All these great things were going to take place in theory. Well, they didn't have that great of a plan to merge these cultures together, and they ran into the challenge that very predictably that they would encounter, which is they diluted all the skill sets of the original groups. And so we came in and conducted a debrief first and talked with all the leaders and said, why is this not working? Talked to the people on the front lines closest to the action who are now asked to sell new products and they never had before. Why is this not working for you? What are the challenges? What are the root causes for failure? And not only that, we talked about the successes. There's always a pocket of success to debrief. Go find that person who's figured it out. Go have a conversation with him or her and say, how are you able to succeed here when everyone else isn't? Find those success stories and then begin to mine them for root causes that you can scale across the organization. So we took those debrief trends and we went to with the leadership and we shared all of these insights from the front lines. And at that point, they built their long-term strategic plan. I want to pause here because it's really tempting to take that debrief information and say, oh, that's why we missed our numbers in the second quarter. That's why we were challenged in the past, and then apply it towards the next quarter. Don't do that. Don't apply it towards a short-term plan. Don't take that debrief information and just apply it towards some new short-term activity. Build out your long-term vision for success at this point. If you remember nothing else that I say from this webinar, remember that. Build out that long-term strategic plan. Tell me what success looks like in exquisite detail so that you can break down the barriers between each of the functional groups. Talk about your company in terms of the financial metrics that they're making, what does the culture look like in 3 years, your market position, your branding, the structure of the organization. Here's why. If you build out that long-term strategic plan first, your high-definition destination, we call it, then with a more informed perspective, you can then back into what are the critical few things that we need to do this quarter. If you reverse that conversation, you just say, hey, what do we want to do this quarter? Well, there's 20 things we could do, and you can even make the argument that we should do them, but there's really only 3 things that we must do in order to start marching towards that destination. So begin with the end in mind, then plan how you're going to tackle next quarter. And then finally, once we have that plan in hand, let's brief the team. So they took their high-definition destination, they briefed it all around the world. And by the way, this isn't an hour-long brief. This isn't a 50-page document that lives in a binder that nobody reads. This is a poster. You put it on the wall and you say, this is where we're going as a team. This is what we stand for. This is what success looks like. So everybody can capture it at a glance and they can use it as the North Star, the filter for all of their activities. And once we brief the team, we've communicated the leader's intent to everyone, which, by the way, is one of the big challenges we always get posed. You know, they say, I used to be in charge of 80 people, now I'm in charge of 1,000. How do I scale my efforts to that group? We can't go around shaking everybody's hand and looking them in the eye and remembering their first name when you're in charge of 1,000 people. You have to have a system to communicate that and communicate it very succinctly. After we've created that, what we call inspired alignment, you've now got to have the call to action and start execution and create an execution rhythm, a cadence to begin adapting and reacting to that change. So in this example I was sharing with you, they found the 3 critical leverage points. They said, these are the most important things that we're going to focus on as a team to turn the battleship, to right our sails, to fix the Q1 and Q2 challenges where they missed their forecast by a wide margin. And we'll focus on exclusively these 3 things. Anything else that we're doing gets turned off. We're only doing these 3 things. And when they were focused like a laser beam, it allowed them to be agile and adapt and react to the inevitable changes, the inevitable threats that took place within the marketplace, so that by the end of Q4, not only did they meet their number, they blew it out of the water. It was $20 million higher than they were forecasted to be. All right, so for your teams, the next steps to take to begin marching down this path towards organizational agility. Create that learning culture today from debriefs and collaborative planning. Have conversations in a nameless, rankless fashion. Go start talking about that big success you had. Don't debrief the train wreck, debrief the big sale that everybody wants to talk about. Find the root cause for that. Identify at least one lesson learned. What's one thing that everyone can take away from that in a positive way and implement in their own activities so that they're more successful. Use collaborative planning where you invite all the stakeholders. We're always challenged by teams that say, well, you know, I was able to get 80% of the people I wanted in the room for the plan. I'll say, well, let's wait for 100%. This is the one time where we'll make sure that we get everybody in the room, we look them in the eye, we shake hands across the aisle, we come up with an aligned plan, an aligned vision, and we have a accountability and buy-in and fingerprints on the plan so that we can go execute it. Once you got that inspired alignment, I want you to look at it from a long-term perspective. Build that shared vision for success. Everyone within the company should know exactly why you exist. You should be able to stop anyone on your team and say, you know, why do we exist as a team? We have a mantra that we use within Afterburner, and if I stopped anybody on our team, they'd recite it verbatim because we know that's the thing that holds us all together. That's why we exist as a team, and that cements our vision for success as an organization. And then finally, there are 2 sides to the same coin. It's inspired alignment and disciplined execution, but they require very different skill sets to accomplish them. The alignment comes first, and then we need to have very shortly afterwards followed by disciplined execution. There's a great Japanese proverb that says, vision without action is daydreaming. In other words, inspired alignment without action is just daydreaming. Might as well go back to your cubicle and work by yourself. We shouldn't have ever planned together because we never do what we say we're going to do. But then the opposite is just as painful, and that's action without vision is a nightmare. So in other words, if you're in an organization where you're just busy for the sake of being busy, we don't know why we're doing things, we don't have a sense of purpose associated with it, you're going to see high churn, you're going to see folks that are unhappy with their jobs, and they certainly won't be giving as much effort as when you can build that inspired alignment. So if you're looking at these next steps and you're thinking, wow, these aren't too specific, this is a pretty general conversation, I agree with you, and here's why. This is a big transformation. This is a tall order. When you're talking about changing your organization and making it into a more agile culture, it's not easy, but it is worth it. So what I recommend you do, there's entire webinars around debriefs and planning, both of them about 20 minutes long. They will give you the key steps that we take to conduct a debrief or a collaborative planning session. That shared vision for success, that long-term strategic plan, that's the toughest thing we do at Afterburner. That's very challenging, that's heavy lifting, but we've got 3 webinars dedicated to that as well. Go check those out, and you'll at least be on your way to building that. Once again, it's the most important thing you can do for your team so that you can take your hands off the steering wheel and this culture just exists. This is the way that we scale our leadership when we go from leading 80 people to 1,000. We have a long-term vision for success that everyone can embrace. And finally, connect that discipline execution through weekly updates, through light but frequent touches with the team, with the leader working behind the scenes to make sure we're identifying the inevitable threats and navigating around them and potentially getting the champion to change the resources and provide more so we're ultimately successful. All right, at this time, we will move to the Q&A portion of our presentation. You can type your questions into the chat or Q&A box, and we'll see them there. We'd love to connect with folks offline as well. You can email me directly at thor@afterburner.com or reach out to us on social media to keep the discussion going. Also, while you're doing that, make sure you register for our next webinar where we'll discuss how to lead during a crisis. This webinar will be hosted by another one of Afterburner's executive consultants, Matt Brady, who some of you may have met. And wow, Matt Brady's such a special story. He was a West Point grad. He went off to fly helicopters in some of our nation's most important missions. He was the helicopter pilot on the Lone Survivor mission that's chronicled for Marcus Luttrell and his SEAL team that went in there. And he's going to talk about how you lead during this crisis situation. He went off to Harvard Business School and wrote a paper for that there as well. So don't miss that next webinar. At this point, we're going to turn it over to our lovely producer, Ansley, and she's going to assist me as we dive into our questions. Ansley.
Thank you. Our first question is, if we work for a large organization and don't have the ability to implement these processes company-wide, how do we add this value?
Great question. So basically you're saying, hey, I'm not the CEO, so I can't dictate that we're going to implement this company-wide. And I recognize that. We're probably, in this audience, we have functional leaders, we have project managers, we even have individual contributors, and we have some C-suite team members as well, but for the most part, you're going to only be able to operate within your sphere of influence. And here's what I'd say. Use these same techniques within your own corner of the organization to reach across the aisle, because guess what? The silos still exist within our organization as well. Within our small part of the team, we can break down the silos with these techniques. And the exciting part of that is if you are able to create an agile portion of the organization, not only is it a competitive advantage for you because you're going to be moving faster than the rest of the teams are within the company, but it shines the spotlight upward and it starts to point out the lack of agility in the leadership or the other places on the team. And it's a great sense of urgency. It creates a sense of urgency for the leadership to begin embracing these things as well. It's never too early to start on these things. Now, I will tell you, my favorite way to do this is from top down. I definitely prefer that than working bottom up like we're discussing right now. If you get the CEO's endorsement and you can implement this organization-wide, wow, can you make things happen fast. But you can still see some really exciting outcomes when you build agility into your own corner of the company.
Do you have any advice for implementing Agile in the service business?
Yeah, wow, it's so funny you asked that. We get that question all the time. Everybody's coming to us and saying, we are moving from a product business to a service business, which makes sense, right? Because we, as people in the marketplace, require more service, premium level service at a more consistent rate than ever before in history. And we know that because when AWS had their outage 2 months ago, remember that? AWS has their outage. The front page story was not, hey, golf clap for AWS. They had 3 years running of no outages. It was AWS is off for 4 hours. Its stock price drops, and everybody's holding them immediately accountable. So service is such an important conversation in the marketplace today because the standards are so high. So I'll give you an example of the conversation we had yesterday. They said we have a service portion of our value proposition that we offer to clients, but it's breaking down between each of the silos. So we sell it, and then we sell it just fine, and we have a silo of salespeople that are able to articulate the value, but then as we implement this, it becomes more and more challenging. As one senior vice president of a tech company said to me, it's like we used to sell cars, and when we sold cars, we'd sell one every 3 years or so. It was a big sale. We'd always high-five when we did it, and it was a big complex sale that took a lot of conversations back and forth, but it would happen, and we got really good at it. Well, now it feels like we're selling Uber. This whole service industry means that not only do I have to give them the ride, but I got to have a smile on my face the entire time. I got to keep the customer happy throughout the entire conversation because ultimately I want to have that recurring revenue because it's at a lower level. It's not this huge sale like it was for the car. I got to have the customer lifetime value increased along the way. So long answer to your question, but when you're transitioning from a product mentality to a service mentality, what we advocate is that you create that long-term, overarching vision for success. You got to get the salespeople in the room and to understand it's not just about selling anymore. It's about the entire client journey. It's about from start to finish the entire experience that a client's going to have. And they play one part of that puzzle, but there's going to be 7 or 8 pieces that need to work together in conjunction to make that happen. The only way we can do that is by planning out that long-term vision for success with everybody in the room.
about RPA, robotic process automation. Does this mean that the Agilist individuals can work on their own without the Scrum Agile Masters and or project managers?
So I'll tell you, from my perspective, let's automate everything that we can, right? That only makes things simpler. When we automate the trivial, the mundane, then we create time to be creative. So to the extent that we can automate those things that we shouldn't be using our creative juices for, and if some of that it can be captured in the conversations going on between the Agile leaders and the rest of the team, great, I'm all for it. But here's the big challenge. It's picking those things to automate. And very often the things we end up automating are the very things we should be having human-to-human conversations about. So you got to be very careful about where you apply that approach. Automate as much as you can, right up to that line where it's something that we need to have a creative thinking conversation about to be successful and to stay agile and to adapt and to never put that end user out of the equation for decision making.
You mentioned that we need to start with the culture of trust and safety. Based on your experience, how did you achieve these two?
Yep, so trust and safety, you know, if you can picture a fighter squadron, you've got 30 type A personalities. And, you know, look, I knew people named Iceman and Maverick, and if you've seen Top Gun, those personalities aren't too far from what you experience in our environment. Besides the beach volleyball, the movie is very accurate for the type of activities that we would undertake. So you got to take these type A machismo, used to winning at all costs attitude and turn them into a team and focus on the same thing. And there's a couple ways we do that. Once again, I'm going to go back, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but we create that aligning vision for success first. So we don't say, here's what you look like as the best pilot. We say, here's what we look like as the best squadron, as the best formation, as the best team. And you describe that in exquisite detail and talk how that choreography will work and how the wingman is just as important as the lead, and here's what your role is and into the larger equation. And then the other way you create that trust and safety is through the debrief. I'm not going to go into all the details because it's captured in the debrief webinar, but when you do a debrief where you honestly talk about how we can improve as a team, then you build a lot of trust with that group because they realize that we're not aligned to egos or my career progression. We're aligned to getting better as a group. And that creates a lot of security for a team that wants to work together and improve collectively.
If you could choose one thing that an organization should choose to do first in order to become agile, what would it be?
If I could choose one thing to do first, well, I know the easiest thing to do first, and that is to debrief. And that's because most groups will be happy to start that discussion, particularly about a success. So if you're wondering, where do I start? Thor, you talked about 20 different things here. Which is the very first one that we should do? Take your team aside, think about what they're all excited about in the last 2 quarters, and say, we're going to debrief that. We're going to get to the key to that success, because we know it wasn't just luck and timing. We know that a lot of effort went into that, and there are some root causes that we can scale. And trust me, the people involved will be more than happy to volunteer how they were the reason that this succeeded. Facilitate that conversation, find those root causes, and then show that you're going to scale those to the team, because we're not competing against one another. We're going to share this information. We're going to create new best practices. Now, I said that's what teams like to do the most, that you'll have very little resistance to debriefing. But when you do debrief, what you'll probably learn is that one of the results, the lessons learned from the debrief, is that we're not planning as effectively as we could. So just be aware that you're probably going to have to move very quickly from a debriefing mentality to a planning mentality, because you'll get in the debrief and they'll say, hey, you know, I didn't even know I was supposed to do that. You can't hold me accountable for that. We never had a clear plan. And you'll realize that you have to build that buy-in and earn their trust through that planning session. Debrief first, very quickly followed by plan.
I'm going to combine about 3 or 4 questions on this. I'm still struggling to understand the debrief and part of this context. Can you expand a little bit on this or give a simple scenario and example for a successful debrief?
Yep, sure. So we'll use an example from a sales organization that we debriefed with. And they said it was a merger. They had 2 groups that came together. One group was a very simple transactional sales. It's the equivalent of selling bicycles. And the other group was long, complex, drawn-out sales. It's the equivalent of selling cars with warranties. This is a tech company, so these weren't the products, but just that's the analogy. And as we brought those groups together and said, sell both of these, sell both of them well, now we can serve the bike crowd as well as the car crowd, evenly, they weren't able to merge those cultures and become successful. So we debriefed with the teams. And we found out very clearly that one of the big roadblocks there is that they didn't know the points of sale for these different selling motions. And they had never been trained in some of these things. And it sounds tactical, and it sounds like, well, no duh, why didn't they have that? But that's the level of planning and the level of insights you'll get when you talk to the front line operator, the end user, the person closest to the action. And you take them aside. And when I do a debrief, here's what I listen for. When I listen for that person to say, here's what it comes down to, Thor. Or it's really this. It's really simple. Whatever words come out of their mouth next, that's one of your root causes for either success or failure. And they're closest to the action, but you know what? No one's listened to them. And it's not unique. GE went 100 years before they started doing workouts where they'd actually listen to their frontline employees as well. And if you read the history of GE, you'll see that the workouts were, which are pretty much the equivalent of a debrief, were critical in shifting their culture during the 80s and setting them up for success that we all know about during the 90s.
You say to be a successful company, you need to have a shared vision and plan. This is a culture change and a shift that is going to take time to implement. What advice would you give a large company to stay the course as the culture changes?
So if I'm understanding your question right, you're saying we're going to change, but we got a day job to do at the same time. And by the way, this very often comes up in the products transitioning to as a service company as well, where they say, hey, we can't stop selling the product. Don't stop selling that car, even though we're selling Uber at the same time now. We got to do both at the same time. We got to change the engine while we're in flight. And what I tell them is, if you find those critical leverage points for the change that's going to take place, if you don't allow 20 things to be important and you don't try to boil the ocean and you only focus on the 3 critical leverage points that you back into from that vision or plan, that allows us to keep time to do our day jobs. Because that's really the big challenge. Nobody ever says, all right, stop, we're going to totally change our company. Starting now, we're only doing this. You're making a transition over time. And so you have to have a focus on the critical few and be greedy. Don't let it get scope creep. Don't let that 3 items morph into 4 or 5. Keep it at 3, as disciplined as you can, until you get the results from those 3, and then you can transition off of those once you complete your first missions.
How do you operate in an agile environment when operating under earned value requirements?
It's a really tough conversation, and it takes a strong leader to overcome it. And we can think of leaders like Jeff Bezos at Amazon, who would stand up in front of the crowd during his earnings calls and say, we are going to lose money again this quarter, and not only that, I'm going to extend my forecast and show how we're going to lose company money for an additional year. But because he was that strong leader and he had a clear strategic vision and he had that shared common idea of what success looked like in the long term, the market trusted him. And every time he would go out there, it was amazing. He'd go out there and say, we're going to lose again this quarter. The stock price would go up, and you'd watch this happen again and again. But you could see that they were sticking to a clear, very cohesive strategy, very cohesive plan, very cohesive definition of success and how they're going to get there.
What do you do when the top general understands Agile, talks the talk about Agile, but doesn't walk the walk?
It's a really tough one. When we do a debrief, one of the things that our clients get excited about is they think, oh, I can't wait. Now that you're giving me permission to do a debrief, I get to go tell Sally what I really think of her. Like, I get to tell Bill how he never shows up to work on time and all the things I wanted to have conversations about. You're giving me that freedom? And we'll say, no, not really. The conversation doesn't start with Bill and Sally. It starts with you. When you stand up in front of the crowd as a leader, instead of pointing the finger at everybody else in the room, you have to first acknowledge the inevitable mistakes that you made up until that point. You're not begging for forgiveness. You're not apologizing to them. You're just saying, hey, mistakes happen. There's no such thing as a perfect mission. I've identified 2 things I'm going to do differently, and as the leader, here's how I'm going to change. And then you can transition into conversations about everybody else. It's very difficult, though, to have an agile organization where the leader doesn't walk the walk. It's almost impossible to have an entire organization. You have pockets of success, but an entire organization where the leader doesn't allow him or herself to be vulnerable in the same way. Because then you lose your sense of trust and security, right? Because if I'm watching this, I'm saying, well, if the leader never makes mistakes, I certainly can't either.
I know my company can't make these changes overnight. What's the #1 most important aspect to begin using immediately to remain agile in our market? So
I think this is a similar question as the previous one. The debriefs, I can't tell you enough how debriefs change organizations, and how after we teach companies how to debrief and teams how to debrief, I get email after email about how they can finally stop leading aggressively, being micromanagers. They can take their hands off the steering wheel because now they're creating a learning culture. Think about those times you've been on a great team in your life, and we all have. The times when it just flowed, it just felt natural, and we had a great leader. The leader probably wasn't working that hard. The leader probably wasn't even the smartest person in the room. But what the leader did a good job is creating that system, that environment that allowed for continuous learning and iterative process to take place where the team got better without them having to micromanage it.
One of the concepts of Agile is we are not beholden to a long-term plan. If you create a long-term strategy, aren't you reversing that?
Oh, good question. So this, if you went back to our first slide, we said that it's adapting to change over that rigid plan, right? Now you're telling me we got to have this plan, not just a plan, but a plan for 3 years from now? Are you kidding me? And I'll tell you what most companies say when I say 3 years. They basically spit out their coffee and they say, this market changes so fast, that may work with your other companies. There's no way I can look 3 years down the road and try to figure out what success looks like. And I push back and I say, if you get your team together and you create that North Star for success, that anchoring vision for what could be based on financial metrics, the culture, the value proposition, the brand in the marketplace, the structure of the organization, you paint that out in exquisite detail, you're going to find that as there's inevitable turbulence, as there's inevitable change, that destination will not change very much. Here's how I know that's true. We supported one of the companies that went through the largest tech merger in history, right? And if ever there was to be a turbulent time, it's when two huge behemoth companies come together. Well, they had created their high-definition destination before this announcement was ever made about this merger, and we went back after it, and we said, all right, so what needs to change? We've got these two huge companies together now. What's changing in our destination? They changed like 5 words. It was because they clearly painted out what success was going to be. It didn't matter that they had new resources here and there or maybe a couple new threats here and there. Their destination stayed the same, and more importantly, it anchored the entire team for what success looked like. Something does have to change, though. Something does have to give. Here's what does change, and here's what allows you to be agile. Because you have this vision for success, you're able to navigate the inevitable pop-up threats and pop-up resources that take place. The path to get to your destination will change. I promise you, whatever you think your path to get there is going to look like will be drastically different as soon as you go. It reminds me of the moon landing that we did in 1969, where we knew 3 years before we ever landed in the moon. In 1966, they picked out a size of land about the size, 60 by 60 feet, and said, this is where we're going to land. And that was the destination for that team for 3 years. Now, they'd changed their path to get there. They even changed it mid-flight based off of what that destination was. But that was the anchoring vision for success for that entire team.
We have time for one last question. How do you prevent getting caught up in the long-term strategy and losing the value the Agile model brings?
Great question. So once again, how do I stop from getting caught up in long-term strategy? I don't let long-term strategy have scope creep. I don't let it be the critical 12 things we need to do. We keep that strategy confined to the critical few. We know our destination. We know what initial steps we're going to take because we don't know the entire path to get there. And I'm constantly refining those steps. I'm constantly taking a look at my environment and changing my path, changing those critical leverage points based on the changes in the marketplace. New threats, new resources, new opportunities. I'm going to change the strategy to get to the same destination. All right, ladies and gentlemen. Well, that was the final call to action, is to go look at the other webinars. Go check out those other things we talked about in this one. This is a pretty heavy, heavy lifting concept that we're talking about, changing the entire organization. There's some underarching concepts that you can get more details on and start implementing right now. Go look at the debrief, look at the planning, do a deeper dive into the methodology that will bring agility to your team. Watch the debriefing webinar, watch the strategic session webinar, and watch our next one as Matt Brady hosts Leading During a Crisis, and we find out what he did during the lone survivor mission when he was called to go pick up Marcus Luttrell and his team when they came under fire, as chronicled in the movie. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen. Over and out.